Now, there is a part of the world that is very problematic because in it there live some very, very rich people. But in it, most of the people are poor. So, I mean, it's a place of dichotomy in a way that's hard for us to imagine in the United States of America. I mean, we have a serious dichotomy in the United States right now, but nothing compared to what exists in Latin America. And the most important part of Latin America is South America. And it's a very problematic continent. Now, South America, or Latin America, is a place where the economic challenges of the global economy are very important because in order to survive, you have to be able to participate in the global economy. You have to be able to pay the price of the oil, otherwise you can't move, or run your industry, and you have to be able to export goods in sufficient amounts so that your economy has a kind of dynamism to it. I mean, simply surviving as survival agriculture is no answer. So let's look for a moment at this problematic place. For the United States of America, Latin America was the first place in which hatred of Americans developed, the gringo. We had that with Mexico. And then came, in 1959, the problem of Cuba. Now, Cuba's very small. It's a small place. I mean, it's a big island, but it's a small place. It has about 10 million people. Why worry about Cuba? Well, the worry about Cuba always was that Castro, and he still does, imagined himself not simply the leader of Cuba. If he only saw himself as the leader of Cuba, he wouldn't be very dangerous, right? So he couldn't go swim in Cuba. The reason why Castro was dangerous was that he saw himself as the vanguard of revolution all over South America, Latin America. And in fact, if you go to Cuba, the symbol that you see on the wall all the time it's the face not of Castro, of Che Guevara. Che Guevara was the leader of the revolution who left Cuba to organize a revolution in Bolivia. And in fact, that took place just before a revolution took place in Chile when Allende came to power. There are lots of poor people, and they're unhappy. So Castro was viewed as dangerous because he was going to, that was his aim, mobilize them into a revolution all over Latin America, and that was, from the point of view of the United States of America, absolutely intolerable. If all he was going to do is seize beaches in Cuba, who cared? And in fact, Castro became, for many poor people all over Latin America, a hero. He wasn't just a hero in Cuba. He was a hero in Latin America, and in fact, in some places, remains that. The president of Venezuela, whose name is Chavez, sees Castro as his hero. And Chavez controls oil. So let's look at Latin America for a moment in terms of its divisions. You can divide Latin America in two ways. You can divide it geographically, or you can divide it racially. Geographically, you can divide it up into 3, 4, or 5 areas. The most interesting thing about Latin America initially is its spine. The spine of Latin America is a chain of mountains, comparatively new, that go along the west coast. They look now like the continuation of the Rockies, but they're really not, because the histories of South America and North America are different. They didn't come together until fairly recently. They were floating over on their tectonic plates, who knows where. So these are called the Andes, and this defines a region. The people who live up in the mountains or in the foothills of the mountains, starting from Ecuador, Colombia, Ecuador, Peru, Bolivia, Chile, those are Andean countries. And a good part of them are very, very poor, because it's hard to make a living in the Andes. High up on the mountains, way up there on the Altiplano in Bolivia and Peru, it's cold. Even potatoes shiver. I mean, it's not Florida. Okay. So, the second region has to do with the vast interior. There is a river. Certainly at points, in terms of its water volume, it most likely is the greatest river in the world, because at points it's so wide that if you're in the middle of it, you can't see the north side and you can't see the south side. It's called the Amazon. That rises in the Andes and flows here, but if it's just the Amazon, which is very wide, that's one thing. There are hundreds of tributaries. Every few miles, another river comes into the Amazon. It's very much like the Mississippi with all its tributaries. So it basically drains the water out of northern and central South America. And it's an area that historically was filled with rainforests. So all along these rivers, there were and are rainforests. It's very different from the Andes. It's flat, lush, filled with lizards, spiders, beautiful trees, I mean, whatever, you know, sloths, I mean, whatever. They're all there. And in fact, a huge part of South America is this drainage system. And it contains enormous wealth. Whether you're talking about its organic life or its mineral life or whatever else it be, or even the soil, I mean, it contains the potential of enormous wealth. Now, there's another river system. It's the South River system. The South River system also starts up in the mountains in the Andes and flows eastward toward the Atlantic. And there are two rivers in particular, the Paraná and the Paraguay. But there are lots of other tributaries, the Uruguay and whatever, and they all empty out where Buenos Aires is. And that drains the whole, do I got it? Southern part. It's like a big, so all this water is coming down from the sky, and then it has to run off, and then it runs out of two exits, the Amazon and what's called the Rio de la Plata. Now, there are two other regions. One is along the coast of the Caribbean. If you're on the Caribbean, you're sort of connected with Central America and Cuba. I mean, you're in Caracas and you are part of South America, but your orientation is toward the Caribbean. It's very much like North Africa is a Mediterranean place, not very much connected to the part of Africa south of the Sahara. And the last is what we call the Atlantic coast. The Atlantic coast has behind it a low range of mountains. Compared to the Andes, you would call them the Brazilian bumps. No, it's just relative. Do you understand? I mean, here be Mount Everest, but there they're not very high. And then behind them lies the great basin of the Amazon. Now, a second way of dividing Latin America is by race. The founding race of Latin America, the people who were there as far back as we can figure out, are called the Amerindians. They are the blood brothers and sisters of the Amerindians in North America. And they were all over Latin America, thicker on the west coast than on the east coast. Today, they've pretty well disappeared along the east coast. Some remain in the Amazon, not in large numbers. They're mainly concentrated on the west coast, high up in the Andes, in Bolivia and Peru and Ecuador. That's where they are. But at one time, they were everywhere. A second race are the Africans who were brought over as slaves. The Amerindians either were too weak to do the work that the Europeans wanted, or they died out from diseases brought by the Europeans. So, into South America, after all, Africa is just a short distance, across, into Latin America are brought all these blacks. Now, you can't talk about northern Colombia, Venezuela, Guyana, or Brazil without talking about blacks, because you bump into millions of them. In Brazil in particular, if you're in northern Brazil, the country sometimes appears to be a black country. So it's all these Africans have been brought over. They were not native to South America, and they didn't come over voluntarily. They came over because they were taken by Europeans as slaves. So if the west coast is sort of Indian, the east coast, where Brazil is very black. It's a very big distinction between the two parts of Latin America. And then the next group are the whites, the Europeans, that started arriving in the 16th century. And the whites are mainly concentrated in the places where the climate is more familiar to them. The climate that is most European in South America is in the south. The northern climate, where the equator is, which passes through northern South America, is very hot and was malarial and so forth. So you have whites down here, whites in the south, Indians in the west, blacks in the east, and a mixture in the north. In addition, you have two other groups who become a very important part of the story of Latin America and Brazil. They are the half-whites and the half-Indians. They're called mestizos. You see a lot of them up in the Andes. You see fewer of them in Brazil because Brazil basically eliminated its Indians. So there are some mestizos. If you go into the Amazon, you can see them. But then the other group that's very prominent on the East Coast are the mulattoes. That is the half white, half black, or of varying mixtures that occur, and they constitute a large part of the population of the East Coast and of Brazil. Now, I mention this to you because the boundaries of Latin America were drawn by Spanish and Portuguese bureaucrats. They don't correspond to anything historic. There wasn't something called the Ecuadorian nation. Ecuador is like Wayne County. Got it? Was there a people called the Waynians who lived here? When the whites arrived, the Waynians were here, so we drew boundaries around the what? The Waynians. No Waynians. It's just a bunch of Europeans drawing lines. Got it? And the lines go through races. And in every one of these nations, that's one of the problems of Latin America. In order to understand Brazil, you have to understand it. Every one of these nations contains a mixture of races and nations. White people in Peru do not wish to socialize with the Indians. They'd rather socialize with white people from Europe. So you can call them both Peruvian. What difference does it make? That's partially true in North America, isn't it? If we're talking about white and black in the Detroit area, generally people in Oakland County who are white do not spend their social time with the black population. They may have au pairs who are white, do you understand, who come from Spain or whatever it is, or they'll travel. That's their socializing. So that's the story of Latin America. All these boundaries were administrative boundaries drawn by the European conquerors, the Spanish and the Portuguese. Now, in drawing the boundaries, the Portuguese got a big boon. The Portuguese initially settled on the east coast. The Spanish took the north coast and the what? And the west coast. And then they had to draw a line, but nobody was inside the interior. Since the Portuguese had the mouth of the Amazon, what did the Spanish know? The Portuguese laid claim to all the water, or all the area drained by the Amazon and its tributaries. Oh. That's what the French did with Louisiana. They took the mouth, and then they said, oh, we got the Mississippi. Now all the area, that took care of, do you understand? Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Wisconsin, Minnesota, Montana. We got it? That's all you have to do. So in the end, what they discovered, much to the chagrin of the Spanish, was that if you drain, the drainage system of the Amazon takes up at least 1/3 of the entire continent. And so that became Brazil. So if Brazil sticks all the way almost to the west, it's because it's all part of this what? Amazon drainage system. And when the boundaries finally were finalized, that's what happened. So always claim, if you're exploring, the mouth of a river. I mean, you don't know how much, do you understand? The whole drainage system that comes down through that hole. So that's how Brazil emerged, and Brazil is, again, an administrative boundary. There was no group of Amerindians called Brazilians living there. When you go to Brazil, you will see it. It's a country of many races. And one of the great problems of Latin America, which reinforces the poverty, is the intense racism. It's by no mere coincidence that the whites are on top and the Indians, mestizos, mulattoes, and blacks are on the bottom. Wherever you go. Doesn't make any difference. Wherever you go, that's the case. How did the whites manage to stand up there on top? Well, you know. They came, they conquered, and they took almost all the land, and they reduced the other people to either servants or slaves, or they imported the slaves. And so that's the prelude to understanding Brazil, which, as you can see, is the largest country territorially in Latin America. It has close to 4 million square miles. It's bigger than the continental United States. in size. It dwarfs the other countries of Latin America, and it now has the largest population. The latest statistic is that Brazil has 180 million people. As I'm speaking to you, it may already be up to 100. The birth rate is terrific. If you have poverty, what? High birth rate. It may be up to 185 million people. I mean, maybe heading toward 200 million. I mean, it will certainly surpass that of the United States of America. Just a matter of a few decades. They're on the roll. Now, Brazil, because it had so many blacks and mulattoes, was viewed for years as one of the poorest countries in Latin America. Because was there wealth? Could you go to Brazil and have a good time? Oh, sure. But for the overwhelming majority of the people in the country, that was not true. They weren't dancing at Copacabana. That's our picture, with Carmen Miranda singing with the bananas over here. Okay. That isn't where they were. They were desperately poor. And in fact, at the end of the 19th century, close to 70% of the population, or over maybe 75, was black or mulatto. And they were at the bottom. In fact, the country that was always viewed as the prosperous country in Latin America was the country that was all white. That was Argentina. And Argentinians always looked down on Brazilians. Brazil always has the echo of, black. You like the music, the samba's nice, but I mean, it's not as nice as the tango, but I mean, it's okay. Always look down on it. And for racial reasons. Do not confuse us with Brazil, Argentinians used to say. We're both in South America, but we're what? We're white. Well, you know what those Brazilians are. Okay. But over the last 11 years, this country that was viewed as one of the poverty-stricken nations of the world has experienced an incredible reversal. It's on the way up. It's moving up. Argentina is going down. When you visit Buenos Aires, it's charming and lovely if you're in the right place. But the country is what? Going down. People are emigrating from it. Brazil, on the other hand, which was despised by the Argentinians, is now on the way up. It's an interesting reversal, and that's the central theme of what we call the talk here. We're looking at a country that was down and is rising. When I read about General Motors this morning in the paper, I was asking myself, are we rising? No. I mean, no. History's very interesting. History's cruel. You never always stay on top. I don't know whether, are we going up? But in Brazil, given where they were, they're going up. So now let me give you some background in Brazil. The first is the coming of the whites. What lived here before were the Amerindians, thinly distributed along the East Coast. Most of them belonged to a group that we call Tupi. And they weren't as well organized as their cousins on the West Coast, the Inca. They lived in small villages. They did engage in agriculture. they grew maize and a tuber that looks like our modern potato. All right? And basically that was the source of their nutrition. There was some minimal hunting, and they fought with each other all the time because things were scarce and life was hard. And the Portuguese arrived at the beginning of the 16th century. Actually, the first man to go along the coast of Brazil was an Italian. He's very important. His name was Amerigo Vespucci. Now, he is what I call lucky. The person who gets there first gets all the streets named after him. So, some map maker in Germany took his first name, Amerigo, turned it into Latin, which is Americus, and out of it got the word American. We are all named after this obscure, do you understand, Italian explorer who got there first. But after him came the Portuguese, and the Portuguese explorer and settler and conqueror was a man called Cabral, and he first landed on the northern coast. And what he discovered, or what the Portuguese discovered, was that you could grow something there that came to be called white gold. It was the foundation of Brazil. The story of Brazil is moving from one major product to another. The first major product of the place was sugar. They did find wood, which got the name Brazil wood, which was shipped to Europe, but that wasn't the major thing. The thing that set the colony off, the reason why white people came there, they were not going to lie on the beaches. They went there to make money. And what they were growing was sugar. And the Portuguese established a colony which was named after the wood that they first found there, Brazil. And this Portuguese colony became a very important part of the Portuguese Empire. Very early, the Amerindians died off. They were enslaved, and then they caught all those terrible diseases, including smallpox, that the Europeans brought. They had no immunities to any of them, and they just what? Massively died. Sugar cultivation requires intense, cheap labor. It was available just across the ocean in Africa, and now they brought into Brazil the foundation population. Most of the blacks you will see in Brazil are descended from people who came over in the 16th century. Most of them are poor. The white people you see, their ancestors may have arrived 60 years ago. They're doing far better. So the blacks are of the foundation population of this country. They were brought to work as slaves on the plantations, and from the very beginning there was a problem in Brazil, which was to remain a very important issue. The balance between whites and blacks. The white slave owners were always worried that there were so many blacks. It was like 1 white to 9 blacks. There were so many that they would rise up in a rebellion and kill their white masters. So the issue of balance between whites and blacks was very important. Now the Portuguese found collaborators. Through hanky-panky, they produced a third population called mulattoes. Is a mulatto a black or a white? Well, when mulattoes behave white, then they're called Uncle Toms. They're collaborators, right? I mean, they think white and they want to be part of the white world. So the mulattoes actually preferred to identify with the whites rather than with the blacks, even though they were treated pretty badly. And that provided a source of collaborators, at least, for the whites. It was a very, very rich colony, and great fortunes were made. So rich was the colony that in the 1620s, the Dutch came and took the colony and held it for almost 20 years. But the Portuguese came back, and they retook the colony, and it became an integral part of Portugal. Along the way, the Portuguese, who were very Catholic, brought Christian missionaries, and they converted the Amerindians, and they tried to convert the blacks who brought their own religion from West Africa or Central Africa. Still today, if you go to this area of Brazil, you will find that the blacks practice a kind of mixed religion. Sometimes it's called macumba. It's mixed Catholic and voodoo put together. Now, as the missionaries came, they established missions all along the coast. In fact, their missions went all the way down the coast, all the way down to where Rio is now and Sao Paulo. Sao Paulo started out as a mission. Now, there was not only the mulatto population, there was also the mestizo, the half Indian, half white. Some of the mestizos who were more familiar with the interior found a European animal called the cow, and they took it into the interior where they could be cowboys, undisciplined by the Portuguese governors, and they became the gauchos of Brazil. The name for the gauchos of Brazil were the bandeirantes, and they were all up and down the coast. They had connections with the Indians, they had connections with the whites. The settlement was only along the coast. They never crossed the mountain, and they never went up the river. Just along the coast. But it was such a vast area and such a long coast, the Portuguese could barely master it. Now, in the end of the 17th century, the beginning of the 18th century, the major product changed. In fact, by the 18th century, sugar was still important, but there was another thing that was found. The bandeirantes found it while they were in the mountains north of Rio, in a place called Ouro Preto. They found gold, and that triggered a gold rush, like the Klondike, remember, or San Francisco or whatever. It couldn't be as big as those gold rushes because they didn't have steamships. So people wanting to come from Europe or whatever else it was to the place would have to take sort of leaky vessels with sails. Okay. But thousands and thousands of people, many of them from northern Brazil, now came down here. They needed a port which would take the gold out. And so there was created a city. The city was Rio de Janeiro, right? That was the port city. The gold was brought down to Rio, and Rio now became the important port of Brazil. As sugar declined and gold was big, the center of Brazil shifted. It shifted from the north to the south. And after a while, the old capital of Bahia, which is called Salvador and sometimes Bahia, the old capital was abandoned as the capital, and the new capital was created at Rio. Rio was Gold City, Bahia was Sugar City, and now, again, fortunes are made. And in fact, more Portuguese come out. There are more mulattoes, more mestizos, and the menial work, you know who does the menial work. The menial work is done by either the Indians, the mestizos, the mulattoes, or the blacks. The whites are in charge in Brazil, and the last white man who shows up has far more privileges than any black man whose ancestors may have lived there for 300 years. Doesn't make any difference. Now, at the beginning of the 19th century, the gold was beginning to run out. But there was still enough gold to keep things going, and sugar was still working, and then something interesting happened. A war started in Europe. The war featured the French Revolution and General Napoleon. And General Napoleon invaded Spain and Portugal and conquered them. The king of Portugal became a refugee. And the question was, where should he go? You may remember Winston Churchill said that if the Nazis come and take England, this war will not what? Stop, we'll go to Canada. Do you understand? We will never, remember, never surrender. So the king of Portugal, whose name was John the Sixth, where could he go? Rio. So he moved to Rio. In the early part of the 19th century, the king of Portugal, Lisbon is taken by the French. The king of Portugal moves to Rio and makes Rio the capital of Portugal. Once he lands and he sees Sugarloaf and Copa and the whole thing, he doesn't want to go home. If you've been to Lisbon, I mean, Lisbon's a dump compared to Rio. In fact, now there was a huge Portuguese population living in Brazil. It was almost as large as the Portuguese population living in Portugal. In addition, there were all these mulattoes and blacks and Indians and mestizos and whatever. Brazil had more people. The colony had more people than the motherland. Portugal's a little country. So he settled in and he loved it. He built himself a palace. And then the worst thing that could have happened would be that Napoleon would be defeated. He'd have to go home. Well, Napoleon was defeated. And now the people in Lisbon, in Portugal, say to their king, "Come home." He says, "I'm coming," like Jack Benny with the robber, you know. I'm thinking, I'm coming. So, I mean, Napoleon's defeated in 1815 at Waterloo. So come on, 1816. Come on, 1817. When are you leaving? When are you coming home? Not coming home. Finally, in 1821, they sent an ultimatum. You don't come home? That's how attractive Rio is. You don't come home? We're getting a whole new royal family. Do you get it? So John the Sixth then says, I'm coming home. So he leaves for Lisbon, and he leaves his son, whose name is Peter. The way you say Peter in Portuguese is Pedro. He leaves Pedro in charge of Brazil. It's 1821. When he gets back to Lisbon, he's aged now, and they say, well, the heir to the throne should be here too. So he sends a message to Pedro to come home. And Pedro says, I'm not coming home. Wait, did you understand? I'm not coming back to Detroit. I am not coming home. And what he then proceeds to do, with the help of the British, who want to control the trade with Brazil, and they have the Navy, what he then proceeds to do is to declare independence. His father has left, the king of Portugal, and now he's in Brazil. He can't really call himself king because, he actually, disobeyed his father. He chooses for himself an imposing title that was used by Napoleon. After all, he's got this big country, right? He calls himself the Emperor of Brazil. And in 1822, Brazil, which was a colony of Portugal, becomes an independent empire. Well, it's big enough to be an empire, but I mean, it's a little pretentious, wouldn't you say? And so now Rio becomes the capital of the Empire of Brazil. And if anybody asks you a question, or maybe it's a crossword puzzle, who was the first emperor to reign in the Western Hemisphere? You now know, right? It's Pedro, otherwise known as Pedro the First. And actually, when Brazil declares its independence, or Pedro declares Brazil's independence, Brazil has more Portuguese than there are Portuguese in Portugal, as today there are more Anglo-Saxons living in the United States than exist in England. So the colony became bigger. And now it's on its way. The problem is the economy. The first problem is really Pedro. Pedro the First is impossible. By 1832, his son, known as Pedro the Second, conspires against him, and Papa is kicked out of his job. And now will appear the man who is usually identified as the Emperor of Brazil. It's Pedro the Second, and with Pedro the Second now comes product number 3. Sugar is so cheap on the market you can't make much money. The blacks are now starving up in northern Brazil. Does anybody care? No. They're slaves and they're starving. Gold has run out. And then comes the thing which won't be called that anymore. There's a new word that's appearing in English. It's called Starbucks. I never ask for coffee anymore. I just ask for Starbucks because the word Starbucks and the word coffee have become what? Identical. Everywhere you go, it's what? There's another Starbucks, right? You just walk in, give me a Starbucks. I'll have a tall Starbucks, a big Starbucks, whatever else it is. But the product used to be called coffee. And so what they discovered was that in the area not far from Rio, near what is Sao Paulo, which was a mission, the way San Francisco was a mission, or San Diego was a mission, it was a Catholic mission, and the hills there, it's on the edge of the mountains, this thing called coffee could grow, and in fact the demand for coffee was growing in the Western world. So they planted coffee, and now all of a sudden, product number 3 shows up. Remember Brazilian coffee? Is it as good as Colombian coffee? I don't know. Brazilian coffee now appears, and now sugar fades, and what? Gold fades, and now coffee comes, and now there's money, and there's the emperor. Well, the emperor uses money to build splendid palaces. In fact, he builds a city that all tourists will see generally when they go to Rio. It's north of Rio. It's called Petropolis. It's the city of Peter, so it's named after him. And it's just a gorgeous place. You go see the palaces and the whole thing. Pedro lived very, very well. But there was a major problem. It's one that I've mentioned. There is a small group of white people at the top who are rich. And there is a huge number of blacks at the bottom who don't have anything, and now sugar has collapsed in the north, got it? And the gold mines don't need their labor, and they outnumber the whites 4-1. So the United States of America, which is one of the last countries in the world to abolish slavery. Isn't that strange? We always talk about our wonderful Constitution, but our Constitution allowed what? It allowed slavery. The United States of America doesn't abolish slavery until fully until 1865. Brazil still has slaves. They're afraid to liberate them because, the whole idea was, then what's going to happen? They're going to take over the country. The leaders of the army were opposed. The army, of course, was attached to the landowners. The landowners were the people who owned the land, whether it was sugar land or coffee land or whatever else it was. The first son always got the what? The plantation, and the second son became a bishop, and the third son became an officer in the army. That was the purpose of the army. So now, the army, attached to the landowners, they don't want to liberate the slaves. But Pedro II did something foolish from his point of view. In 1888, because the international pressure was now what? Overwhelming. It's 1888. And they got slavery in a supposedly Christian country. He frees the slaves without consulting the army. Oh. And they get so mad at him, they overthrow him. And in 1889, they declare that Brazil is a republic. And they choose one of their own people to be the president. And Pedro II is now out of a job. The empire is finished, but the issue remains. Now the army takes over. And the army has an ideology. What it says is there's various things we need to do. We need to transform this country from being simply an agricultural country. We have to what? Industrialize it. Oh, well, that sounds pretty good. But we can't industrialize it with our present population. The whites are too vulnerable. So what we need to do is to import large numbers of whites. And that's what happened after 1889. Most of the whites in Brazil are not Portuguese by origin anymore. They were in 1889. They have come from all over Europe. They've been there for about 100 years. At that time, there was overpopulation in many countries in Europe. One of them was Italy. And in fact, thousands and hundreds of thousands of Italians were invited to come to Brazil. When they came, they didn't settle in the north. That was too hot. That was played out sugar territory. They landed in Rio, and then they went to Sao Paulo and whatever, and further south. Huge numbers of Italians. People of Italian origin in Brazil, as in Argentina, are very, very large. And as time went on, there were more and more white people. The white people didn't work on the farms. They wanted to work in the cities, so there was the beginning of what we call the development of certain industries. A basic industry would be textiles, right? In order to provide clothing for the people. In addition to the Italians, thousands of Germans came. I'm not talking about the Germans who came after Hitler. There are thousands of Germans who came, and they settled generally in the south. So the north was black, and the south became white or whiter. I do want to tell you, this campaign was so successful that today 55% of the people in Brazil are white. And 45%, do you understand, are black or mulatto. Now that's a reversal from 75-25 to 55-45. I mean, you'd have to import all these people. And that has changed. So now if you're in the South and you bump into Brazilians, they tend to be white. If you're in the North, they tend to be black or mulatto. And so the whitening campaign worked. And I'll tell you what happened that enabled the Republic to do this. A new product appeared. Number 4. Without it, I'm not sure this campaign would have worked. Bicycles were now being used. Later on, automobiles. And they run on something called tires. And for tires, you need rubber. And there is a tree that I've seen in the Amazon. Do you understand? With a sap, whatever else it is. I mean, it's the rubber tree. If you take its essence, then you can make tires. This tree was unique to the Amazon. And now, for the first time in their history, they had to do something. You have to understand, Brazil had all this territory, got it? But it really was, it's like Siberia. It was uninvestigated. All the people lived along the what? Lived along the coast. Nobody wanted to go into the interior, into those rainforests. What would they do there? So now, for the first time, they penetrate the rainforest. They go up the Amazon. And in fact, during the great rubber era, at the beginning of the 20th century, the end of the 19th, the beginning of the 20th, they build a city in the middle of rubber land. It's way up the river. I was just there recently. It's called Manaus. And Manaus became so rich, produced such wealth for the white people who came there, that they built an opera house. And in fact, Enrico Caruso insisted on going there to perform. They gave him so much money that he took a boat to Brazil, went up the Amazon to the middle of the rainforest. And there in the middle of the rainforest is this city, like the Klondike. And they're making money hand over fist. The one thing they don't want to do is let this tree or its saplings out of the country. But you know, go check. Ultimately, they smuggle out the tree or the sapling, and then they plant it in Southeast Asia where it grows better. And in fact, when you get to 1914, the rubber industry has collapsed. And Manaus is now a ghost town. Boom! Collapse. But it lasted long enough to keep the republic going. It provided a kind of new insert of money. Again, the money was shared by the whites, but the number of whites is now increasing. Italians and Germans and even some Welsh and whatever they all show up in Brazil, and they settle down in the south. And now a new city begins to evolve, mainly created by the white people. It's called Sao Paulo, right? Which is today one of the largest cities in the whole world. They even settle down in the right places in Rio. They move out of the center of town, and then they move south past Sugarloaf, turn the corner, and then they find it. The beach. It's called Copacabana, right? Copacabana. It was not turned over, by the way, initially to the blacks. You got it? This was Bloomfield Hills. This was the white section of town, and so it moves. Now, the Republic had various challenges. One, the tension between what? The rich and the poor, right? Between the whites and the blacks, that wouldn't go away. No matter how many white people they imported, they still had this terrible imbalance. The second problem was that once the rubber industry began to collapse, the whole interior was neglected. Most of the wealth of Brazil potentially lies in the interior, in the Amazon basin, but nobody wanted to go in there. Everything was along the coast, which limited economic opportunity. If you have all these peasants, black peasants, who are making nothing, certainly moving them into the interior and giving them land would what? Isn't that what we did in America? If you couldn't get land in Pennsylvania, you crossed the Appalachians and you what? You came to Michigan, or you came to Ohio, or you came to Indiana, you got some land. But they didn't do anything. So it was a major, major problem. The third problem was called the Depression. The Depression came to Brazil. Brazil was still relying heavily on coffee. Rubber was gone. And the price of coffee what? Goes. And the net result is that the country goes into a major downspin. It's heading down, and there are protests and riots and whatever else it is. And then he arrives. The Juan Perón of Brazil. I'm going to give you a name. His name is everywhere. When I was a child, he was the dictator of Brazil. His name is Getúlio Vargas. V-A-R-G-A-S. And in Portuguese, you do a lot of shh all the time. No. In some languages, they can't say sh, but they say a lot of it in Portuguese. So it's Getúlio Vargas, and Vargas was a politician who won the support of the army. And using the army, he conducted a military coup because the disorder now was becoming impossible. He was to some degree inspired, because of the Italian influence, by Benito Mussolini, do you understand, who'd already started an experiment in social control in Italy. And he uses the army, he takes over, he centralizes everything, and he announces what he calls the Estado Novo, the new state. This will be a state that will be neither capitalist nor socialist. Oh. It will be a state of law and order in which the poor will receive support and welfare. So he becomes a hero, like, Franklin Delano Roosevelt. He's a contemporary of Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Is he an admirer of fascism? Yes. Does he produce in Brazil a fascist state? Not really, but there's heavy central government control, and now Vargas does it. He says, the only way to build this country is for us to invest. So he now begins to build factories. We're going to make a steel mill. We're going to make an automobile factory. Got it? This is Juan Perón. We're going to build our own factories, and they will be owned by the state, and we will create the jobs. We're not going to wait for foreign investors. They're not around in this depression. Of course, you have to borrow money in order to do this, right? But he manages to do this, and now there develops a whole new state industrial economy, mainly centered in the South. He intends to give land to the blacks in the North, but he never...
I haven't made up my mind yet. What are you going to take?
Algebra.
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 Algebra! 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 Algebra!
If no one's explained how algebra, geometry, and calculus can improve your future, demand that you be told. Call NACME. We'll tell you.
But he never really gets around to it. But he improves the economy enough, and he adds a certain level of social security, got it, the whole thing. All of a sudden, he becomes very popular. And in fact, when World War II comes around, and you can see the handwriting on the wall, he signs up with the United States and not with Germany and Italy. The Brazilians actually declare war on the Germans and the Italians, and Brazil emerges as one of the victors of the war, whatever that means. They had a few troops on some of the battlefields. But he now has created a new Brazil, where before Brazil was heavily decentralized, it's now centralized. It now has a welfare system. I mean, the biggest boulevard in Rio is called Vargas Boulevard. It goes, runs all the way down. There was Vargas Airport and Vargas Boulevard and Vargas Institute and Vargas this and Vargas that. So he's one of the important figures. He's more important than Pedro II. However, the economy begins to fail. One, the state-owned industries are inefficient. They're badly managed. Two, the population is growing at such a rate because of the poverty that it's uncontrollable. In fact, the army deposes him in 1945, right after the war. But he's so popular with the people, he comes back. And in the early 1950s, he is elected freely, not as a dictator. He is elected as the president of Brazil because the army doesn't know how to manage this economy. However, and they'll take you to it if you're a tourist, he commits suicide. I mean, Hitler committed suicide, but what? I mean, they had him surrounded in the bunker. Obviously, the burdens of office and the inability to solve the problems of the Brazilian economy and the fear of another military coup drove him into suicide. He kills himself. And when he kills himself, I mean, it's like a big hole. Who's going to take care of Brazil? They hold an election. And a man emerges who is the beginning of what we call the recovery, although it was hard initially to tell. His name was Kubitschek. He was Slavic by origin. By the way, it's a proof of what? All the immigrants that came, Poles, do you understand, Slovaks, whatever, who came to Brazil. They were part of the white immigration that was brought by the new republic, and Kubitschek now becomes the president. And he has a vision. He is to do something that is part of the recovery. And this is the theme. In order for Brazil to conquer its poverty, it obviously has to defeat racism. But in order to defeat the racism, they have to have economic wealth. In order to do that, Brazil has to escape from being simply along the beach. Brazil has to move into its what? Vast interior, filled with enormous riches. Kubitschek says, that's what we need to do. Vargas never did that. And what the sign of Kubitschek's resolution, which caused coronaries in Rio, was he said, we are moving the capital of the country into the interior. That happened in Michigan in 1847. The capital of Michigan was Detroit. And then one day the farmers outstate said, no, that's not fair. We need to create a capital that's in the center. So out of the blue, they invented Lansing. I mean, Lansing had no history. It was an artificial thing, do you understand? Created by bureaucratic, it still looks like an artificial thing, created by bureaucratic, they decided to move it into the middle of the state. Well, so he says, if we're serious about the interior, I got the place. There's a tributary of a river that flows into the Amazon. And there we're going to build a new capital. Over the mountains. We're going to name it Brasilia. And we're going to invite the most famous, Oscar Niemeyer, whatever. We're going to invite the most famous, Mies van der, all the famous architects and designers are going to come, and we're going to design a city which is the city of the future. We're finally going to do it. We got all this wealth, and we're not even touching it. So, by 1960, they're moving. He tells all the bureaucrats in Rio, you're going to have to move. It's like telling people in New York, do you understand? They're going to have to move to Butte, Montana. I mean, they fought it for years. It took them years and years before they could persuade all the government offices to pick themselves up from Sugarloaf and Copacabana and move into the middle. I mean, nothing. I mean, you have to see it. The soil, by the way, when you cut down the trees, is red. It's like Georgia, you know, that kind of red soil from Georgia. It's red, flat, red. I mean, the whole thing, you know. There are people in Brasilia who dream of moving to Detroit, so. But he didn't care. This was the symbol of the what? Of the new Brazil. He was going to change it. He was going to solve all the social problems by finding the wealth that would transform it. We are the biggest country in Latin America, and we only use a small part of it along the coast. Well, Kubitschek was very popular, and in fact, he began to bring people across the mountains. But he died. And then he was followed by one of the, and history is sometimes determined by individual flukes. His name was Kadros, and he was eccentric. He ran, he got elected as the president, he was intellectual, and he didn't like talking to people. And in the middle of his presidency, he resigns. And he's followed by his vice president, whom the army doesn't like. The vice president is a radical who talks about increasing the welfare for the poor and mobilizing the blacks and giving them land. His name is Goulart. And Goulart isn't discreet like Kubitschek. He is a visionary, but when he talks, he sometimes sounds a little bit like Fidel Castro. And I do want to tell you that when Goulart came to power in 1964, Castro was already the ruler of Cuba for 5 years, and everybody in Latin America, including the United States of America, is afraid that if Goulart stays in power, Brazil, Cuba's one thing. Brazil will turn into an ally of Fidel Castro. So in 1964, the army acts. You see how they intervene? The story is what? Of continuous army intervention. The army acts to overthrow Goulart. Goulart is overthrown. And the army now takes over. And they are to remain in control for 21 years until 1985. The first time I went to Brazil, the ruler of Brazil was the army. And they found army officers to be president. Was there a kind of election? Not really. They had various names, Da Silva, Medici, Figueiredo. It doesn't make any difference. They were all what? They all sort of looked alike, right? The purpose of the army was to make sure that a Castro-type revolution did not take place in Brazil. Already Guevara had gone to where? To Bolivia. And in the early 1970s, Allende, there was the takeover in Chile by the socialists who admired Castro. So and they received a lot of help from the United States of America. Their job was to what? Keep things down. The problem was that they knew nothing about managing an economy. Nothing. So by 1982 and 83, something was rampant in Brazil. It's called inflation. Got it? What they would do to deal with lack of money was to print what? More of it. It's a temporary solution. And so if you wanted to buy a newspaper, you needed a wheelbarrow filled with money because the money was what? I mean, Brazil suffered from these periodic inflations. The first time I was there, I was going crazy. The bills were like millions and millions, and I mean, the whole thing was crazy. So the army was failing. By 1985, the fear of Castro and communism were gone, right? I mean, Castro was a has-been, waiting for tourists. And Gorbachev is trying to put together the Soviet Union, and China is now going capitalist. I mean, the whole thing. So now the army realizes that they will have to turn power over to a civilian regime. So they arranged for an election with a kind of select candidate. His name was Neves, and he died after he was elected. So his vice president, Sarney, now became the president of Brazil. And Sarney didn't have any idea of what needed to be done, because once they fell, the military group fell, there were all these problems. So let me just mention the problems. There was the continuing dichotomy between the what? The rich and the poor, and the white and the black. The new problem was that blacks were so desperate in the Brazilian north, they were migrating in large numbers to the Brazilian south. Just in North America, they came from the south to the north, there they went, and now they arrive in Rio. And they arrive in Sao Paulo by the thousands. They're poor people, do you understand? I want a job, I want a job. Where are they going to stay? Well, Stalin would either have shot them or picked them up and moved them back to where they didn't want to be. But in Brazil now that was impossible. So there now arose what you see in Rio and what you see in Sao Paulo. There's the beach. See, everybody lives along the coast, got it? They don't want to live on an Amazon thing in the interior, okay? So everybody's along the coast, and the rich, now since they learned to swim, want to be by the water. So it's very, you see this in Rio, it's peculiar. The rich people are low down. Usually the rich people want to be what? High up. No. They're low down, all the high rises along the what? The beach. Then behind you are the hills, got it? The mountains. In the mountains there are things called favelas. Favelas are slum villages. They're slum towns. That's what they are. So if you're in a favela, you got a $5 million view. No, you're looking for miles out there. Meanwhile, the rich people are down below by the beach. If you ask me, you can keep the beach. I'll take the what? I'll take the. But they didn't ask me. When I arrived, and I was there with a group of people last October and early November, we went through one of the favelas just to see what it was like. And so these are all homes built illegally. Got it? On land that was basically owned by the state up at the top of the hill, and the people came and they occupied it, and they're not prepared to kick them out. And so they organized their own little governments, and they tapped into water or no water or whatever else it is. Hundreds of thousands of poor people, mestizos, mulattoes, blacks, some whites. Interestingly enough, their slums don't look like ours. Most of the favelas, actually, are fairly well run. The people are desperately poor. I mean, the houses are made out of, they're like shacks. But there's an order there that you don't find often in what we would call North American slums. But they are slums, and there are all these people, and there's high unemployment. And in the favela we went through, there was low crime. That's why we went through it. But in lots of the other favelas, there's obviously what? There's drugs and high crime. So now, just try to imagine Bloomfield Hills. I mean, I know there's Pontiac north of it. Try to imagine hills all around Bloomfield Hills, higher than Bloomfield Hills, and on tops of the hills are Detroit slums. They're all up there. Got it? All looking down. Got this picture? That's Brazil, and that became a major problem because the migration will not stop. What are these people supposed to do up north? They don't have any jobs and they don't have any land. The only jobs are obviously in the industries in the south. The third problem was the Amazon. After all this talk and moving the capital into the interior, it's still not developed. There are two groups of people standing in the way. One of them are the people, who say, who wants to go live in the Amazon? The other, and it's very interesting, so now I'm going to give you the problem. We had it in Michigan. So they're called environmentalists. The environmentalists say there are 253 billion species of organisms in this forest. If we go in and cut down the trees and people build farm, whatever else it is, then what? Then what? They'll be gone, an irreparable loss to humanity. Now in Michigan, remember we had this argument. There were lumbermen up in the Upper Peninsula. They were workers. They were poor. They wanted a job. They wanted to cut down the trees. And that's how they could get enough money to pay for their family. Meanwhile, the bourgeois environmentalists came along and said, no! Well, it's easy for you. You're living in Birmingham. We need a job. Our job, our work is cutting down trees. So, for the masses of people in Brazil who want land, they're not interested in saving the organisms. They're interested in what? Land and jobs. And in fact, they're perfectly willing to move into the interior. So the problem is, do you open up the interior to all these landless people, or whoever they are, to get land, or were you elected by the organisms? Meanwhile, because everybody watches television, even in the favela, they can see what's going on in the rest of the world. They can see they don't have most of the things being advertised on television. So what you now trigger is what we call rising. There are all these rising expectations. The welfare system is primitive, and the racism is still strong. But in 1994, there was elected a president by the name of Cardozo. And Cardozo, over a period of 8 years, began a process. The process was to take advantage of the interior. It started before him, but it was accelerated under his presidency. The idea was to bring thousands and thousands of people into the area. There's an area south of the rainforest, which is called the Mato Grosso, which is sort of a kind of scrub prairie. And you can grow something on there. It's now one of the major products of Brazil. The only exposure I ever had to it was in a Chinese restaurant. Soy sauce. Soybeans, I want to tell you, soybeans are magic. The price is what? good on the international market, and soybeans grow very well in this vast southern interior, and now hundreds of thousands of people, some of them landless, some of them investors, doesn't make any difference, some of them landowners from the north, who knows what, have poured into this area. And now you can travel for miles. There are new dusty roads, and there are all these people, and there's all this growing, and there's all this new agriculture. It has suddenly started up. And in addition, there's all this lumber. We did it in Michigan. We cut down all the trees. There are a few left. We cut down the trees. So now, is that money? Will that enable poor people to survive? Yes. So now they're pouring in, and there are supposed restrictions. Sometimes they're enforced, but generally they're what? They're not, and they're cutting down the trees in the rainforest. Is that good for the economy? Temporarily what? Yes. And now there are foreign investors who are investing, and now industry around Sao Paulo is booming. But now, before the break, let me tell you about the surprise. Mr. Cardozo has the Constitution amended so that he can serve more than one term. But in the last election, which was held 2 years ago, a man arises. He has been trying since 1989 to be president. His name is Lula, and he represents the workers. He's the leader of the union. And he says, I represent the voice of the underprivileged who have been crushed. Most of the profits still go to the what? The whites and the rich and the whole thing. Vote for me, and I will take some of this new wealth and I will redistribute it. Oh. And I want to tell you, 2 years ago, despite the Cardozo performance, he, the leader of the Workers' Party, gets elected president of Brazil. So now here's the question. Can a leader of the Workers' Party, who often sounds like a Marxist, can he lead a, do you understand, a dramatic revival in the economy, or will he destroy it? If you want to find out, come back in 5 minutes. Thank you. About one of the phenomena in Latin America. There are many countries where the economies are improving. Venezuela is one of them. And I talked about Venezuela in a previous talk because they have all this oil, right, which they're selling. But now there's democracy. Well, if you have a country in which the overwhelming majority of the people are middle class, you most likely will get a fairly conservative government in an election. That's the United States of America. But if you have democracy, and it's really free, and most of the people in the country are poor, then what you're going to get elected is maybe a radical party that has to manage an economy that has to function in the global economy. Got it? Because once you give people one person, one vote, well. So that happened in Venezuela. That's happened in Brazil. Most of the people feel that they're getting far less than they deserve. In particular, blacks and mulattoes and, some of the working class whites and whatever. So they elect this populist. But now he has to manage an economy that works in the global economy. Oh. So we call this brand of politics, where you're trying to marry the global economy to the poor, we call it populism. Sounds a little bit like George Wallace sometimes and Huey Long and whatever, but it also sounds like Salvador Allende in Chile, and sometimes there are edges of Castro there. In order to win the election, you have to say to the people that when you vote for me and I win, I'm going to distribute the income more fairly than it is right now. I'm going to create a welfare system. But that's always the problem, because if the welfare system becomes too high or too large, then somehow moving into the global economy becomes more difficult. So that's Lula's problem. And by the way, we have these populist regimes now in Latin America. They're committed to basically a lot of privatization and free enterprise and the global economy, and simultaneously with an extensive welfare system. So it's politically different from the United States. It's similar to what existed in Europe for a while. So you have that now in Brazil with Lula. You have it in Venezuela with Chavez. You have it in Argentina now with Kirchner. They're all populists. And you have it now in Bolivia. So it's a trend in Latin America that's different from North America. Global economy, welfare state, and you've got a huge group of people who need a lot. Got it? And you've got democracy. If you didn't have democracy, you wouldn't have to worry about the poor voting. But now you've given them the vote. So let me just point out the changes that have taken place in Brazil as a result of all the things that have happened, certainly over the last 100 years, and in particular over the last 12. The population of Brazil continues to rise. 2, the white population of Brazil, as I mentioned to you, has now reached 55. It's a majority. Where before it was down to 25, it's now what? It's now 55. That's a major, major change. And when you go to Brazil now, you will encounter, if you're certainly in the south, in Rio, Sao Paulo, whatever, you're going to encounter lots and lots of whites. The country is becoming overwhelmingly urbanized. All these people are fleeing the farms where they can't make any money, and they're coming down to the cities. They'd rather live up in the favelas, up in the hills. Maybe they'll get some kind of employment, whatever it be. Sao Paulo, metropolitan Sao Paulo, has over 20 million people. The change is that Brazilians are now, for the first time, moving in fairly large numbers into the interior. They are now listening to the American adage, "Go west, young man." They're crossing. It's a change. The inflation is under control. It went wild for years. It's now under control. And starting with Cardozo, and even before, there has begun the selling of state industries to private investors, which means not simply to Brazilian investors, but also to foreign investors, which has improved the management of the industries. And one of the major changes was, while before people in Brazil were pessimistic, always wanting to put their money out there in some other bank somewhere in some other country, maybe they can get out of the country or whatever else it is. Now, they have a great deal of optimism for the future of their country. They're beginning to feel strong. But among these changes are to be found the tensions between the rich and the overwhelming majority of the people who are still poor or near poor, the tension still between whites and blacks, between whites and Indians. There aren't many Indians left. Most of them are out here in the Amazon, but the tension is that now whites and blacks and mulattoes, whatever, are now moving into the interior. And the Indians want to keep their what? their land, and now they're moving in, like Oklahoma. And then there's the tension between the expansionists who want to improve the economy by moving in, and the environmentalists who want to what? Keep the people out. I talked to several people. We had a conversation about Brazil about 3 weeks ago. And they're very intense environmentalists, and they just can't figure out why we can't keep all these people out. I said, well, you know, it depends on where you are. You're rich enough to travel to Brazil. And then you go there and you look at the organisms, and you want to, and you want to save them, and you want to save them. And I mean, I understand. Then you come back home and you're comfortable. But if I were a poor peasant with no land, I want to tell you, I wouldn't worry about the tree. Are you saying to me the tree is more important than me? And then there's the tension between Catholics and Protestants. The Roman Catholic Church does not have a good history in Brazil of paying attention to the poor. They were generally controlled by people who were related to the landowners, and they didn't do very much. Certainly during the military dictatorship, there arose a movement that tried to be sensitive to the poor called liberation theology, whatever it was. But the Catholic Church never really responded. So what has happened is the major export of the United States of America to Brazil are Protestant fundamentalist missionaries. They are everywhere, of all varieties, Pentecostalists, Southern Baptists, it doesn't make any difference. Church of God, Assembly of God, doesn't make any difference. And the people they work with are the people that all the liberals don't want to spend time with. They talk about them and they love them. They're called the poor. So, they go into do you understand? They go up the Amazon to all these poor Indian villages where the Catholic Church hasn't done anything and the government hasn't done anything, and they organize them, and they have a hall, they teach them sanitation, do you understand? They teach them how to take care of their families appropriately, they bring in some kind of modern medicine, and they convert them. So now it's the Church of God. You can't find a Catholic up the Amazon. It's all, and it isn't like the Methodists or the Episcopalians. They're not there. The Church of God, the Assembly, it's all those fundamentalists who helped to win the election for George Bush Jr. One of the things they do is they go in, they have missionaries, they're cheap labor who dedicate themselves to working with these people. And many of the kids of my liberal friends would want to know what the pension is. No. What are the benefits if I do this? What am I going to get? They go in. And not only that, they've gone in all over Brazil. Amazing story of religion, all having to do with economy. One of the reasons for the growth of Protestant fundamentalism is that they address the issue of poverty. 20% of the people in Brazil are now Protestant, in a country where the Protestant religion used to be forbidden, and it's growing. And the Catholic Church is shrinking. They're doing the same thing here. You can go to the center of Detroit. Now, does that mean a liberal vote or a conservative vote from these people? Well, these people are taught to be self-reliant because they use a little help from the state. Yes, but it's an interesting transformation. It's a lesson, by the way, to liberals. Liberals always want the government to go in and what? Change it now. These people don't. They go straight to the people and they what? They reorganize them, they improve their community life and whatever, they convert them to Protestant fundamentalism. And now Brazil has one of the largest Protestant fundamentalist populations in the world. And then comes Lula. So now Lula walks in. First of all, Lula never wore a tie. The moment he got elected president, he's got a tie. And a nice suit. And now he's meeting with presidents of corporations. And now some of the Marxist vocabulary begins to fade away, and pretty soon he's beginning to sound like Tony Blair. Not as good looking as Tony Blair, but he's bumping into reality. That is, if Brazil is going to succeed, then something has to be done. We can't create this very expensive welfare state now because we're trying to build the what? The economy. So now there are hundreds of corporate presidents who like Lula. They like him because he knows how to talk to poor people who will vote for him, and he knows how to talk to corporate presidents. Has he done a lot for the poor people since he's become president? The answer is no. Is he letting Brazil function successfully in the global economy? The answer is yes. So what are the realities? Brazil is becoming a leading power in the world. No doubt about it. I want to tell you about some of the industries that were started by the state. One of them is aircraft. Many countries are now buying their small airplanes, do you understand, from, who can believe it? Brazil? Brazil is one of the leading manufacturers of weapons in the world. These industries were started by the state. Now some of them are privatized. The weapons industry is very big. If you want weapons, you can go to Brazil. Brazil is now developing an industrial economy that can sell products of high quality on the open market. When I was a child, Brazil meant coffee. And I didn't think it was as good as Colombian, so that was it. 2, there is rapid growth. And the rapid growth is triggered to a large degree by what we call the development of the interior, which, as I said, is, to say the least, controversial. The Amazon is shrinking. I say, no, the river isn't shrinking. The river is there, and the tributaries, but the rainforest, I should say, the Amazon, it's shrinking. There's no doubt about it. You can see whole areas. People said to me, it's a good thing you're here now. Come back in 5 years, the trees aren't going to be there. They just cut them down. And you can, and I had been there some 10 years before, and areas where there was just unintruded rainforest, they're now little towns, and little villages and whatever. It's all, people are now what? Moving, they're moving in. The left is developing. It's this new kind of politics in Latin America. The government talks left but behaves right. Got this thing? It's an interesting thing. It talks left, it talks about rescuing the poor and whatever, and from time to time they do. Lula, for instance, decided not to build a particular highway or dam and to give the money to the poor, but it's all what? It's like small stuff. There's nothing structural that really has changed. By the way, one of the tactics of these populist governments is to renegotiate the debt. They say to all these other people, fine, you want us to all go communist? Don't do anything. We've borrowed money from you and we can't pay it all back to the banks. And we want debt relief. I told you that story when I talked about Argentina. We want debt relief. We want you to cancel part of the debt because the interest on the debt, if we have to pay it, will use up the whole national revenue. So, in fact, Western powers, the more prosperous powers in North America and Europe, have a vested interest in doing that because otherwise the alternative is what? The collapse of the economies. Now, I do want to tell you there's rebellion. There are many people who voted for Lula who are mad. You promised us redistribution of income, and now you're dressing up in a tie and a suit and meeting with the corporate presidents of the club? Traitor! So far, they haven't been able to organize a sufficiently large group of people in Parliament to prevent his program, but they have organized, and it may be interesting in the next election what will happen. There'll be secessionist groups from the left who will say, Lula betrayed us. One of the things Lula does, it's a populist thing, Chavez does it in Venezuela. He says, the gringo, they don't do the word gringo down there, but I mean, the North Americans look down on us. They've always thought of us as secondary people to be used and exploited. We are here to make Brazil a great nation. In fact, we hope that at the end of the 21st century, that it will be as great as the United States of America. We got the people, we got the cheap labor, we got the resources. So built into Brazilian nationalism, any kind of Latin American nationalism, is a certain hostility to the North Americans because it's the rebellion of the children against the parents, right? And what now has emerged, I call it the new populism. You have somebody on the left who's in charge of the government. You have an economy that's becoming more and more privatized. You have a welfare system that is basically inadequate. You improve it to some degree, but you can't improve it greatly, because if you improve it greatly, then the cost of your labor will be prohibitive. And I call it the new populism. Most of the new populism isn't so much economic reform for the poor, although they will benefit from a dynamic economy. It's nationalism. It's making people feel that their nation is what? Strong. When you're in Argentina, people used to walk around saying, oh, Argentina, Argentina, Argentina. That's gone. But in Brazil, they're beginning to feel their, got it? Feel their oats. And it's very interesting to listen to them and to hear them. There's a kind of level of optimism. Do they have problems? They have what? Overwhelming problems. But do they have a sense of moving up and not down? The mood in Brazil is different from Michigan. We're much better off than most Brazilians. Do you understand? Much better off. But we have a sense of what? Going down. They have a sense of, so I call this series Nations on the Rise. That is, they have a sense of going up. So I do want to tell you, if you want an exciting trip, go to Brazil. And you got to go to Rio, see the Copa, Corcovado and the whole thing. You want to go to Sao Paulo even to see that dirty industry, and you must go through a favela. You have to see the favelas. And then you want to go to Ouro Preto and see where the gold mines were. And then you want to go to the north and see where the Afro-Brazilian culture is located. Then you certainly want to go to the interior and get on a boat on the Amazon and see what's happening to this world. It's absolutely spectacular, but when you travel around, you realize you are traveling through a country that has the potential of becoming, certainly by the end of the 21st century, a significant and powerful nation nobody would have ever suspected. Brazilian to me meant Carmen Miranda, whom I loved. And now Brazil means something else. So thank you all very, very much.